The notification popped up on my phone screen at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my corner office on the 35th floor of the Frostbank Tower, Austin's skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hill country rolled out like a painted canvas in the distance, and I'd been reviewing acquisition reports when my personal phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma, I can't do this anymore. You're never around, always working. Ashley gets it. She understands what I need. I'm moving out today. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Take care of yourself. I stared at the message for a full 30 seconds, my Mont Blanc pen frozen halfway to the contract I'd been signing. 3 years together, a ring that had cost more than most people's cars, wedding planning that had consumed our weekends for months, and Jake Morrison had just ended it all through a text message that could have been written by a teenager breaking up after homecoming. My assistant Marcus knocked gently on the glass door. Ms. Sullivan, the Morrison Tech files you requested are ready for review. I looked up at him, probably with an expression that revealed nothing. I'd mastered that look over the past 5 years, building RedBridge Capital from a small investment fund into one of Austin's most influential venture capital firms. Thank you, Marcus. Just leave them on the side table. What Jake didn't know, what he'd never bothered to truly understand, despite living with me for 3 years, was that Emma Rodriguez from South Austin had transformed herself into Emma R. Sullivan, CEO of RedBridge Capital. He saw my long hours as neglect. He saw my business trips as abandonment. He saw my success as something that took away from him instead of something we could build together. I picked up my phone and read his message again. Ashley. Of course, it was Ashley Brooks, the lifestyle influencer with her perfectly curated Instagram feed and her sponsorship deals with yoga mat companies. The woman who had time to post 3 times a day about her morning smoothies and afternoon Pilates sessions because she'd never built anything more complex than a social media following. The irony wasn't lost on me as I reached for the Morrison Tech Solutions folder that Marcus had placed on my desk. For the past 6 months, Jake had been coming home stressed about his company's financial struggles. His father, Robert, had built Morrison Tech from nothing 20 years ago, creating custom software solutions for small healthcare practices. But the industry had evolved, and they were drowning trying to compete with larger firms that could offer integrated telehealth platforms. Jake would pace around our apartment, running his hands through his dark hair the way he did when he was frustrated. "Dad's too stubborn to admit we need help," he'd say, dropping onto our leather couch with a beer. "We're bleeding clients to tea. These big tech companies, if we don't pivot to telehealth integration soon, we're going to lose everything he built." I'd listened, offered suggestions, even hinted that I might know people who could help. But Jake had this way of dismissing my input with a patronizing smile. "Babe, I appreciate it, but this is pretty complex stuff. Your marketing consulting work is different from what we're dealing with." Marketing consulting. That's what he thought I did. In reality, Emma R. Sullivan had been quietly building a portfolio of healthcare technology investments for the past 3 years. RedBridge Capital owned minority stakes in 7 different companies that had successfully transitioned from traditional healthcare software to telehealth platforms. We'd guided 2 major acquisitions in the past year alone, and I'd become known in the industry as someone who could spot potential in struggling healthcare tech companies. Morrison Tech Solutions had been on my radar for months, not because of Jake, but because their underlying technology was actually solid. They just lacked the capital and strategic vision to scale properly. It was exactly the kind of opportunity RedBridge specialized in transforming. I opened the file and spread the documents across my desk. Financial statements, market analysis, competitive positioning reports. Morrison Tech was hemorrhaging money, just as Jake had been complaining about at home. But buried in their technology patents and client testimonials was a company that could be worth $50 million with the right backing and leadership. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. Jake and Ashley at some trendy coffee shop downtown, her manicured hand resting on his chest, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption read, "New beginnings with my favorite person." I screenshot the image and set my phone aside. The elevator chimed softly, and Marcus appeared in my doorway again. "Ms. Sullivan, Robert Morrison is here for your 4 o'clock meeting." I glanced at my Cartier watch. Jake's father was right on time. He'd been trying to get a meeting with RedBridge for months, probably not realizing that his son's fiancé was the CEO he'd been pursuing. I'd been putting him off, partly because of the personal connection, but mostly because I wanted to see how desperate they'd become. "Send him in, Marcus, and hold my calls for the next hour." Robert Morrison walked into my office with the kind of confidence that comes from 20 years of running your own company, but I could see the stress in the lines around his eyes. He was wearing his best suit, probably the same one he'd worn to Jake's college graduation, and he carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd built something meaningful, but was watching it slip away. "Ms. Sullivan, thank you for finally agreeing to meet with me. I know RedBridge is selective about its partnerships, but I believe Morrison Tech represents exactly the kind of opportunity your firm specializes in." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit. I've been reviewing your materials, and I have to say, your technology platform is impressive. The client retention numbers speak for themselves." His face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. At family dinners, he'd been increasingly quiet, the weight of the company's struggles evident in his posture. "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell potential investors. We're not a failing company. We're a successful company that needs the right partner to reach the next level." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Robert Morrison was a good man. He'd built his company on integrity and genuine care for his clients. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd put Jake through college, paid for his MBA, and had been planning to gradually hand over leadership to his son. But Jake had never shown the kind of strategic thinking that would be required to navigate the company through its current challenges. "Tell me about your son's role in the company," I said carefully. Robert's expression shifted slightly. "Jake handles client relations and some project management. He's got good instincts, but he's still learning the bigger picture aspects of running a business." That was diplomatic. What he wasn't saying was that Jake was comfortable with the day-to-day operations, but had no vision for transformation. He was the kind of person who could maintain what existed, but couldn't innovate or lead through crisis. "And what would you say Morrison Tech needs most right now?" "Capital, obviously. But more than that, we need strategic guidance. Someone who understands the healthcare technology landscape and can help us position ourselves for the telehealth revolution that's already happening." I nodded slowly. "The telehealth market is expected to grow by 300% over the next 5 years. Companies that don't adapt will be left behind." "Exactly. That's why I've been so persistent about getting this meeting. RedBridge has a reputation for taking solid companies and helping them become industry leaders." My phone buzzed again. Another photo from Jake and Ashley, this time at what looked like a happy hour somewhere on Rainy Street. They were sharing a plate of appetizers, Ashley's perfectly contoured face glowing in the golden hour light. The caption read, "Finally found someone who prioritizes what matters." I turned my phone face down and refocused on Robert. "Mr. Morrison, I'm interested in discussing a potential partnership, but I want to be completely transparent with you about what that would entail. RedBridge doesn't just provide capital, we provide strategic oversight, which often means significant changes in leadership structure and operational approach." He leaned forward. "I'm listening." "We'd want to bring in our own management team to oversee the transition. Your son would remain in his current role, but the strategic decisions would be handled by professionals who specialize in healthcare technology transformation. I could see him processing this. It wasn't what he'd hoped for, but it wasn't a rejection either. What kind of timeline are we looking at? If we move forward, I'd want to present the opportunity to our board next week. We have a meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. If they approve the partnership, we could have funding in place by the end of the month. Robert's eyes widened. That fast? When we see the right opportunity, we move quickly. But I have to ask, Mr. Morrison, are you prepared for the level of change this would require? Because transformation isn't comfortable, and it often means letting go of how things have always been done. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Keep struggling with the current approach and risk losing everything his father had built, or accept help that would fundamentally change the company's structure. Ms. Sullivan, I've been running this company for 20 years. I've seen it grow from just me and 2 programmers to 35 employees with clients across Texas. But I'm not too proud to admit when I'm in over my head. If RedBridge can save what I've built and help it grow into something bigger, then I'm willing to adapt. I respected his honesty. I'll need complete financial records, client contracts, and technology assessments by Thursday morning. My team will need time to prepare for the board presentation. You'll have everything you need. We shook hands, and I walked him to the elevator. As the doors closed, I returned to my office and picked up my phone. Jake had posted another photo, this time of him and Ashley at some rooftop bar, the Austin skyline twinkling behind them. The caption read, "Life's too short to settle for less than extraordinary." I screenshot that one too. Marcus knocked on my door. Ms. Sullivan, I've prepared the Morrison Tech analysis you requested. Should I schedule the board presentation for Friday? Yes, and Marcus, I want you to reach out to Patricia Hayes. Ask if she's available for dinner tonight. I think I'm going to need some perspective on this situation. Dr. Patricia Hayes had been my mentor since graduate school, the woman who'd convinced me to leave my corporate job and start RedBridge Capital. She'd also been the one to warn me about mixing business with personal relationships, advice I'd clearly ignored when I'd gotten engaged to Jake. That evening, I sat across from Patricia at Uchi, one of Austin's most exclusive restaurants. The kind of place Jake had always said was too expensive for a regular Tuesday night, but where I'd become a regular over the past year. "So he broke up with you via text message," Patricia said, sipping her sake. "And now his father wants RedBridge to save the family company." That's the situation. "And you're considering it?" I showed her the financial projections I'd prepared. Morrison Tech is actually a solid investment opportunity. The technology is sound, the client base is loyal, and with the right leadership, it could be worth $50 million within 2 years. Patricia studied the numbers. These projections are conservative. You could probably get $60 million if you executed the strategy properly. That's what I thought. But that's not really what you're asking me about, is it? I set down my chopsticks. Patricia had a way of cutting through everything to get to the heart of what was really happening. I spent 3 years with someone who never once asked me what I actually did for work, who assumed I was struggling because I worked long hours and traveled frequently, who left me for an Instagram influencer because she understands what he needs. And now you have the opportunity to show him exactly what he walked away from. It's not about revenge, Patricia. It's about consequences. Jake made assumptions about my success, my priorities, my worth. His father is about to discover that the woman his son dismissed as a workaholic marketing consultant is actually the CEO who can save his company. Patricia smiled. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you should do the deal. Not because of Jake, but because Morrison Tech represents exactly the kind of opportunity RedBridge was built to capitalize on. The personal situation is just an interesting coincidence. And if Jake finds out? Then he finds out. But Emma, you've spent the last 5 years building something extraordinary. Don't let his inability to see your worth make you question decisions that are right for your business. She was right, of course. RedBridge Capital had been built on identifying undervalued opportunities and transforming them into industry leaders. Morrison Tech Solutions was exactly that kind of opportunity, regardless of who owned it. I drove home to my new downtown loft, the one I'd been secretly looking at for months but hadn't mentioned to Jake because I knew he'd see it as another sign of my misplaced priorities. The penthouse apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake, a private elevator, and enough space for the kind of entertaining that came with running a successful venture capital firm. Jake had never understood why I needed more than our comfortable but modest apartment in South Austin. He'd grown up in a middle-class family where success meant stability, not growth. Where enough was enough, and ambition beyond a certain point was seen as greedy or selfish. I poured myself a glass of wine and looked out over the city lights. Tomorrow, I'd present the Morrison Tech opportunity to my board. If they approved it, which I was confident they would, I'd be in a position to save the company that Jake's father had spent 20 years building. And Jake Morrison, who'd broken up with me via text message because I was too focused on work, would discover that his ex-fiancé was now his father's business partner. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. "Hey, Emma, it's Ashley. I know this is weird, but I wanted you to know that Jake talks about you a lot. He really cares about you, but he said you two just wanted different things. I hope we can be friends someday. You seem like an amazing woman." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some things didn't deserve acknowledgement, and some people weren't worth the energy it would take to explain why they were wrong. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Austin feel almost like a real autumn city. I stood in my walk-in closet, selecting the navy Armani suit that had become my armor for important board meetings. The one that cost more than Jake's monthly salary, though he'd never known that. He'd always complimented me on my nice work clothes, without realizing that my wardrobe budget exceeded what most people spent on rent. Marcus had already confirmed that all 5 board members would be attending the Morrison Tech presentation. Sarah Kim, our tech sector specialist, David Thompson, who'd built and sold 3 healthcare companies, Jennifer Walsh, former CEO of Austin's largest medical device manufacturer. These weren't people who could be impressed by mediocre opportunities or swayed by emotional appeals. They were seasoned professionals who could smell a bad investment from across the conference room. I reviewed the presentation one final time as my driver navigated through downtown traffic toward the Four Seasons. The numbers were solid, the market analysis was comprehensive, and the strategic vision was clear. Morrison Tech Solutions represented exactly the kind of undervalued asset that RedBridge specialized in transforming. The fact that it was owned by my ex-fiancé's family was irrelevant to the business case. The Four Seasons conference room overlooked Town Lake, and I'd specifically chosen it because the setting conveyed the level of sophistication that RedBridge represented. Crystal water glasses, leather portfolios, and technology that allowed seamless presentations. Everything Jake's father would need to see to understand that this wasn't just another investment meeting. Sarah Kim arrived first, as she always did. She'd been with RedBridge since the beginning, back when we were operating out of a shared workspace in East Austin. "Emma, I've been reviewing the Morrison Tech materials. Their client retention rate is impressive, but their revenue growth has been flat for 18 months. Which is exactly why they're available," I replied, adjusting the projector settings. "They've maximized their current market approach. They need capital and strategic guidance to pivot into telehealth integration." David Thompson entered with his usual confident stride. At 62, he'd been through more healthcare industry transformations than anyone else in Austin. I remember Morrison Tech from the early days. Robert Morrison built something solid, but he's been too conservative to adapt to market changes. Jennifer Walsh settled into her chair and opened her tablet. The question isn't whether they're a good company. The question is whether they can execute the kind of transformation that would justify our investment level. I loved working with these people because they cut straight to the essential issues. No emotional decision-making, no ego-driven analysis. Just clear-eyed assessment of risk and opportunity. Robert Morrison arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, and I could see the moment he stepped into the conference room that he understood this was a different level of business discussion than he was accustomed to. His son Jake had probably never seen a meeting like this. Hell, Jake had probably never been in a room where the collective net worth exceeded $50 million. "Mr. Morrison, please join us," I said, gesturing to the chair at the opposite end of the table. "I'd like you to meet the RedBridge Capital Investment Committee." I made the introductions, watching Robert's expression as he realized that each board member brought decades of experience in exactly the areas where Morrison Tech needed guidance. This wasn't just about money. This was about strategic transformation, guided by people who'd successfully navigated similar challenges. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah began, "we've reviewed your financial statements and market position. Your technology platform is solid, but your growth strategy seems limited to organic expansion within your current client base." Robert nodded. "That's been our approach, yes. We've focused on providing excellent service to existing clients rather than aggressive expansion. Which explains why your revenue has plateaued," David observed. "Clear roles, defined responsibilities, and gradual implementation." "What about the personal connection?" Sarah asked quietly. My board members knew that I'd been engaged, though I'd never mentioned Jake's name or discussed his family background. Sarah was too perceptive not to have noticed something in my demeanor during the meeting. "There's no conflict of interest," I said. "The investment opportunity stands on its own merits." Which was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. That evening, I returned to my apartment and opened a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's car payments. The kind of wine Jake had always said was wasteful, though he'd never hesitated to enjoy it when I brought it home. My phone had been mercifully quiet all day. No more photos from Jake and Ashley's romantic adventures. No more text messages trying to justify his decision. Just silence, which was exactly what I needed to process the day's events. I'd just presented an investment opportunity that could save Morrison Tech Solutions and make Robert Morrison wealthy beyond his expectations. By Monday, I'd know whether Jake's father was willing to accept the partnership that would transform his company. And Jake Morrison, who'd broken up with me because I worked too much and didn't prioritize what mattered, would discover that his ex-fiancé was now positioned to control his family's business future. My laptop chimed with a new email. Marcus had sent me the preliminary contracts for the Morrison Tech acquisition, along with a note that he'd scheduled a follow-up meeting for Monday afternoon, pending Robert's decision. I opened the contracts and began reviewing the terms: employee retention clauses, management transition timelines, performance benchmarks, and buyout provisions. Everything needed to protect both RedBridge's investment and Morrison Tech's existing operations. As I worked through the legal language, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Robert in the elevator. 5 years ago, when I'd left my corporate job to start RedBridge Capital, Jake had been supportive in the abstract way that people are when they don't really understand what you're attempting. "That's great, babe," he'd said when I'd explained my business plan. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." He'd never asked about my investors, my target market, or my growth strategy. He'd never shown interest in the late nights I spent building financial models or the weekend trips I took to meet with potential clients. He'd seen my work as a hobby that kept me busy, not as the foundation of something significant. 3 years later, when RedBridge had completed its first major acquisition and I'd been featured in Austin Business Journal as one of the city's rising entrepreneurs, Jake had barely acknowledged the recognition. "Cool article," he'd said, glancing at the magazine before turning back to his laptop. Even when I'd started earning more than his entire family combined, Jake had continued to see my success as something separate from our relationship. something that competed with his needs rather than something that could enhance our future together. My wine glass was empty, and the contracts were complete. I closed my laptop and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Downtown Austin glittered below me, the same view that Jake had dismissed as too flashy when I'd first shown him the apartment. "Why do you need all this space?" he'd asked, standing in the middle of the living room that could have hosted 30 people for cocktails. "Because I'm building something," I'd replied. "Building what?" I'd tried to explain the networking events, the client meetings, the investor dinners that were essential to growing RedBridge Capital. But Jake had seen it as showing off rather than business necessity. Now, looking out over the city where I'd built my reputation and my company, I realized that Jake had never truly understood what I was building, because he'd never been curious enough to ask the right questions. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Tyler Chen, Jake's business partner. I don't know if you remember me, but we met at a few work events. I heard about you and Jake, and I wanted to say I'm sorry. He made a mistake. Also, I don't know if it matters, but he's been pretty miserable since Tuesday. The Instagram posts are all Ashley's idea. Just thought you should know." I stared at the message for several minutes before deleting it. Tyler Chen was a good guy, Jake's business partner at Morrison Tech, who handled the technical development side of their operations. He was also one of the few people who'd ever asked me thoughtful questions about my work, probably because he understood what it meant to build something from scratch. But his message didn't change anything fundamental about the situation. Jake hadn't left me because he was confused or scared. He'd left me because he'd never valued what I'd built, and Ashley Brooks represented the kind of life he actually wanted. Simple, uncomplicated, focused on immediate gratification rather than long-term achievement. The wine was making me philosophical, which was dangerous. I needed to focus on the business decisions ahead, not the emotional aftermath of a relationship that had probably been doomed from the beginning. Monday would bring Robert Morrison's answer about the RedBridge partnership. If he accepted, Morrison Tech Solutions would begin the most significant transformation in its 20-year history. The company would be saved, modernized, and positioned for growth that could make the Morrison family wealthy. And Jake Morrison would have to reconcile his dismissive attitude toward his workaholic ex-fiancé with the reality that she was now his father's business partner. I finished my wine and prepared for bed, setting my alarm for early morning. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant I had 2 days to finalize the strategic plan that would guide Morrison Tech's transformation. 2 days to prepare for a conversation that would change everything for Jake's family. 2 days before Jake Morrison discovered exactly what he'd walked away from when he'd sent that text message on Tuesday afternoon. Monday morning brought the kind of rain that made Austin's streets slick and reflective, turning the city into a watercolor painting viewed from my office windows. I'd been awake since 5, reviewing contingency plans and finalizing the management structure that would guide Morrison Tech through its transformation. Robert Morrison had until 10 o'clock to call with his decision, and I'd spent the weekend preparing for both possible outcomes. Marcus knocked on my door at exactly 8:30, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression he reserved for particularly complex situations. "Ms. Sullivan, Robert Morrison called 15 minutes ago. He'd like to meet this morning, but he's requesting to bring his son Jake to the discussion." I set down my coffee cup carefully, maintaining the neutral expression that had served me well through countless high-stakes negotiations. Did he indicate why? He said Jake has questions about the partnership structure and wants to understand how it would affect his role in the company. Of course he did. Jake Morrison, who'd spent 3 years dismissing my career as excessive ambition, now wanted to understand the business implications of a deal he couldn't possibly comprehend. The irony was so perfect it almost made me smile. "Schedule them for 9:30, I said. "Conference room B, not the main boardroom. And Marcus, I want you to prepare 2 sets of contracts. one for full partnership, one for a modified structure that gives Morrison Tech more operational control but smaller growth potential. Marcus nodded and made notes on his tablet. Should I inform the board members? Not yet. Let's see what questions Mr. Morrison and his son have first. Healthcare technology is moving toward integrated platforms. Standalone solutions are becoming obsolete. I could see Robert processing this feedback. It wasn't criticism exactly, but it was a clear assessment that Morrison Tech's conservative approach was leading them toward irrelevance. That's why we're interested in partnering with RedBridge, Robert said. We recognize that we need guidance to navigate the changing market. Jennifer leaned forward. Partnership implies mutual benefit, Mr. Morrison. What RedBridge is considering is an acquisition with retained management. You would maintain operational control, but strategic decisions would be made by our team. The distinction was important, and I could see Robert understanding the implications. Jake had probably been telling him that they just needed an investor who would provide capital without interfering with their approach. What RedBridge was offering was fundamental transformation. Walk us through your vision for Morrison Tech's future, I said. Robert cleared his throat and began describing their plans for gradual expansion into telehealth services. As he spoke, I could see the board members exchanging glances. His timeline was too conservative, his market analysis was incomplete, and his understanding of competitive dynamics was outdated. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said gently, the timeline you've described would put Morrison Tech about 3 years behind where the market is heading. Telehealth isn't a future opportunity. It's a current necessity that you're already late to embrace. David pulled up a chart on his tablet. The companies that will dominate this space are the ones moving aggressively now. Gradual transition isn't a viable strategy. Robert's face showed the first signs of real concern. What would you recommend? I stood and activated the presentation screen. Complete platform integration within 6 months. Acquisition of 2 smaller telehealth companies to accelerate development. Rebranding to position Morrison Tech as a comprehensive healthcare technology solutions provider. The slides showed market projections, competitive analysis, and financial modeling that painted a clear picture. Morrison Tech could become a regional leader in healthcare technology, but only with dramatic changes in approach and execution. The investment required would be significant, Jennifer noted. We're talking about a complete transformation, not just capital injection. Which is why the partnership would include management restructuring, I continued. RedBridge would install a strategic oversight team to guide the transition. Robert was quiet for a long moment, studying the projections. And my son's role in this new structure? Jake would continue in client relations, reporting to the new management team. His institutional knowledge and client relationships are valuable, but strategic leadership requires different expertise. It wasn't personal, though it probably felt that way to Robert. Jake was good at maintaining existing relationships and executing established procedures. But he'd never demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that would be required to lead a healthcare technology company through rapid transformation. Sarah pulled up additional financial models. With proper execution, we project Morrison Tech could be worth $60 million within 2 years. That's a 12-fold increase from current valuation. Robert's eyes widened. 60 million? Conservative estimate, David added. If the telehealth market grows as projected, it could be worth more. The room fell silent as Robert processed the implications. His 20-year-old company, which he'd been struggling to keep profitable, could become a major player in healthcare technology. But it would require surrendering the control he'd maintained since founding the company. I need to discuss this with my family, Robert said finally. Of course, I replied. But I should mention that we have another opportunity we're considering. The healthcare technology market is moving quickly, and we can't hold this proposal indefinitely." It wasn't a threat, just business reality. RedBridge had multiple investment opportunities under consideration, and board time was limited. "How long do I have to decide?" "Monday morning," Jennifer said. "We meet again next week, and we'll need a definitive answer." Robert gathered his materials and shook hands with each board member. As I walked him to the elevator, he turned to me with the expression I couldn't quite read. "Ms. Sullivan, can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "You're young to be running a firm like RedBridge. How did you build this?" The question caught me off guard, partly because it was the first time anyone in Jake's family had ever asked about my professional background. "Hard work and good mentors," I said simply. "I started RedBridge 5 years ago with a single investor and a vision for what healthcare technology could become." "5 years," he repeated. "That's remarkable." The elevator arrived, and as the doors closed, I realized that Robert Morrison had just asked me more substantive questions about my career than his son had during our entire 3-year relationship. Back in the conference room, my board members were reviewing their notes. "Strong opportunity," Sarah concluded. "The technology platform has real potential, and the market timing is perfect." "Management transition will be challenging," David noted. "Robert Morrison seems like a good man, but he's going to struggle with surrendering control." Jennifer closed her tablet. "The son concerns me more than the father. Client relations is important, but if he's expecting to inherit leadership of the company, this transition could create internal conflict." I had been thinking the same thing. Jake had probably spent his entire career assuming he would eventually take over Morrison Tech. Learning that his father was partnering with an outside firm to install new management would be a significant blow to his expectations. "We'll structure the transition carefully," I said. I spent the next hour reviewing Jake's role at Morrison Tech, information I'd gathered through industry contacts and public records. He was listed as Director of Client Relations, a position that seemed to involve maintaining existing accounts and coordinating project timelines. Respectable work, but not strategic leadership. He'd been with the company for 4 years since completing his MBA, and his responsibilities had grown incrementally rather than dramatically. The elevator chimed at 9:25, and I watched through my office windows as Robert Morrison emerged, followed by his son. Jake looked exactly as he had on Tuesday morning when he'd left our apartment for the last time, though perhaps slightly more formal in a navy suit I'd helped him select 6 months ago for a client presentation. He was scanning the RedBridge offices with an expression I couldn't quite read, probably calculating square footage and wondering about lease costs, the way he always did when we visited upscale venues. Jake had a habit of mentally pricing everything around him, often commenting afterward about whether people were worth their apparent lifestyle. Marcus escorted them to Conference Room B, which offered impressive views of the Austin skyline, but wasn't quite as imposing as the main boardroom where I'd met with Robert on Friday. I wanted Jake to understand that this was a professional meeting, but I didn't need to overwhelm him with the full scope of RedBridge's capabilities. I gathered the Morrison Tech files and walked down the hallway, my heels echoing against the polished concrete floors. Through the glass walls, I could see Robert explaining something to Jake, who was nodding but looked tense. He'd probably spent the weekend researching RedBridge Capital, finally bothering to understand what his ex-fiancé actually did for work. I opened the conference room door and stepped inside. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," I said, extending my hand to Robert. "Thank you for coming in." Then I turned to Jake, maintaining the same professional demeanor I'd use with any client's family member. "Jake, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Emma Sullivan, CEO of RedBridge Capital." For a moment, Jake simply stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, as his brain processed what he was seeing. Emma Rodriguez, his ex-fiancé who supposedly worked in marketing consulting, standing in a corner office wearing a suit that cost more than his monthly salary, introducing herself as the CEO of the company his father had been desperately trying to partner with. "Emma," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, both of you, have a seat. I understand you have questions about the partnership structure we discussed on Friday." Robert looked between his son and me, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Ms. Sullivan, I should mention that Jake and I had a long conversation over the weekend about Morrison Tech's future. He's raised some valid concerns about the management transition you outlined." I nodded and opened the contract folder. "I'm happy to address any questions. What specific aspects of the partnership are concerning?" Jake cleared his throat, seeming to recover some of his composure. "Ms. Sullivan, my father explained that RedBridge would be installing a new management team to oversee strategic decisions. I'm wondering how that would affect the existing employee structure." His voice was steady, but I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was trying to process this situation professionally, while simultaneously grappling with the personal revelation that his ex-fiancé was the powerful CEO his father had been courting. "Employee retention is a priority for RedBridge," I replied. "We're not interested in disrupting functional operational systems. However, strategic leadership requires specialized expertise in healthcare technology transformation." "And you don't believe the existing team has that expertise?" There was an edge to his voice now, the first hint of the defensiveness I'd seen whenever Jake felt his competence was being questioned. "I believe the existing team has valuable institutional knowledge and client relationships," I said carefully. "But healthcare technology is evolving rapidly, and companies that don't adapt with equal speed will be left behind." Robert leaned forward. "Jake, I've been thinking about this all weekend. We've been struggling for 18 months to maintain our current position. Ms. Sullivan is offering us the opportunity to become a leader in our industry by surrendering control of the company you built," Jake replied, "by partnering with people who understand where this industry is heading." I could see the family dynamic playing out in real time. Robert Morrison, who'd built something significant and was wise enough to recognize when he needed help. Jake Morrison, who'd expected to inherit leadership of that company and was now faced with the reality that he lacked the qualifications to guide it through transformation. "Let me show you something," I said, activating the presentation screen. "This is the current competitive landscape in healthcare technology." The charts displayed market share, growth trajectories, and strategic positioning for companies across the industry. Morrison Tech appeared as a small dot among much larger competitors, their revenue flat while others showed dramatic upward trends. "Your father's company has excellent technology and loyal clients," I continued. "But without strategic transformation, it will become increasingly irrelevant. The companies that are thriving are the ones that pivoted to integrated platforms 2 years ago." Jake studied the data, and I could see him processing the implications. He was smart enough to understand what the charts revealed, even if he didn't want to acknowledge it. "What would my role be in this new structure?" he asked. "You'd continue managing client relationships, reporting to the strategic oversight team. Your institutional knowledge and existing client connections are valuable assets. But I wouldn't be involved in strategic planning. Strategic planning would be handled by professionals with specific expertise in healthcare technology transformation." The distinction was clear, and Jake understood it. He'd expected to gradually assume leadership of Morrison Tech, following the path his father had laid out for him. RedBridge was offering a different future, one where he'd remain in an operational role while others guided the company's strategic direction. Robert cleared his throat. "Son, I know this isn't what we discussed for your career path, but if we don't accept this partnership, there might not be a company for you to inherit." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the financial projections on the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. "Ms. Sullivan, Can I ask how long RedBridge has been considering Morrison Tech as an investment opportunity? The question was loaded, and I could see him trying to understand the timeline. When had his ex-fiancé first identified his family's company as a potential acquisition target? We've been tracking Morrison Tech for approximately 6 months, I said. The healthcare technology sector is a priority for RedBridge, and we monitor companies that have solid fundamentals but limited growth strategies. 6 months, Jake repeated. Jake, Robert interjected, does it matter how long they've been considering us? The important thing is that they're offering us a path forward. But Jake wasn't looking at his father. He was staring at me with an expression that mixed realization with something approaching anger. You've known about our financial problems for 6 months, he said slowly. While I was coming home stressed. About the company's future, you already knew exactly what was happening. Jake, I said carefully, my professional responsibilities include monitoring investment opportunities across multiple industries. That's separate from any personal conversations we might have had. Is it? His voice was rising slightly. Because I spent months worrying about my father's company while my fiancé sat across the dinner table, knowing she could solve our problems with a phone call. Robert looked between us with growing confusion. Wait, you two know each other? The moment had arrived sooner than I'd anticipated, but perhaps it was better to address the personal connection directly, rather than continue pretending it didn't exist. Jake and I were previously engaged, I said to Robert. He ended our relationship last Tuesday. The silence in the room was deafening. Robert's face showed a mixture of shock and dawning understanding, while Jake looked like he'd been physically struck. You're Emma Rodriguez, Robert said quietly. Emma Rodriguez Sullivan, I corrected. I use my mother's maiden name professionally. Robert turned to his son. Jake, you were engaged to Emma Sullivan, the CEO of RedBridge Capital? Jake's face had gone pale. I didn't know. She told me she worked in marketing consulting. I never told you I worked in marketing consulting, I said. You assumed that based on my hours and travel schedule, and I never corrected you. Because you wanted me to think you were struggling. No, because you never asked what I actually did. In 3 years, you never once inquired about my clients, my business model, or my professional goals. Robert was processing this information with visible difficulty. Ms. Sullivan, I need to understand, is this partnership offer connected to your personal relationship with my son? This partnership offer is based entirely on Morrison Tech's business potential, I replied. RedBridge doesn't make investment decisions based on personal relationships. But you've been planning this for months while dating Jake? I've been tracking Morrison Tech as a potential investment opportunity while maintaining professional boundaries around my personal life. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane. You let me worry about my family's company while you were secretly planning to take it over. I wasn't planning to take it over, Jake. I was evaluating whether it represented a viable investment opportunity. What's the difference? The difference is that RedBridge partners with companies to help them grow, not to destroy them. Robert cleared his throat. I think we need to step back and focus on the business opportunity. Personal history aside, does RedBridge still believe Morrison Tech is worth partnering with? I appreciated his attempt to refocus the conversation on professional rather than personal dynamics. Absolutely. The investment thesis hasn't changed. And the terms you outlined on Friday remain the same? They do. Though I've prepared an alternative structure if you prefer more operational control with smaller growth potential. Jake turned from the window. What kind of alternative structure? I opened the second contract folder. RedBridge would provide capital injection and strategic consulting rather than full partnership. Morrison Tech would retain complete operational control, but growth potential would be limited. Robert studied the alternative proposal. What's the difference in projected returns? Under this structure, Morrison Tech could reach 15 million in value within 2 years instead of 60 million. The numbers spoke for themselves. Morrison Tech could maintain independence and modest growth, or accept partnership with RedBridge for dramatic transformation. "I need to discuss this with my family," Robert said finally. "Of course. But I should mention that we have a board meeting scheduled for Thursday afternoon. If Morrison Tech wants to move forward with either option, we'll need a decision by Wednesday." Jake was still standing by the window, his shoulders tense. "And if we don't move forward with RedBridge, then Morrison Tech continues operating as it has been, and RedBridge pursues other opportunities in the healthcare technology sector." The implication was clear. RedBridge would be fine either way, but Morrison Tech's future depended on finding a solution to their current challenges. Robert gathered his materials and stood. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Sullivan, and for the alternative proposal. We'll have an answer for you by Wednesday." Jake followed his father toward the door, but paused at the threshold. "Emma," he said quietly, not turning around, "when did you become someone I didn't recognize?" "I became this person while you were assuming I was someone else," I replied. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, watching the rain streak down the windows. The conversation had gone exactly as I'd expected, though perhaps with more emotional intensity than I'd anticipated. Jake Morrison had spent 3 years with a woman he'd never bothered to truly understand, and now he was discovering that his assumptions had been completely wrong. The woman he'd dismissed as overly ambitious was actually more successful than anyone in his family. The career he'd seen as competition for his attention was actually the foundation of something extraordinary. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Patricia Hayes called. She wants to take you to lunch to discuss how the meeting went." I smiled for the first time that morning. Patricia would appreciate the professional complexity of the situation, and she'd help me maintain perspective about what mattered most. That evening, I received an email from Robert Morrison requesting a follow-up meeting for Tuesday afternoon, just him and Jake. The subject line read, "Additional questions about partnership structure." I stared at the email for a long moment before responding with my availability. Whatever questions the Morrison family had, I'd answer them with the same professional courtesy I'd show any potential business partner. Even if one of those partners was the man who'd broken up with me via text message because he thought I wasn't successful enough to fit into his family's life. Tuesday afternoon arrived with unusual clarity, the kind of post-rain Austin sky that made the city look freshly washed and full of possibility. I'd spent the morning reviewing acquisition timelines for 3 other healthcare technology companies, maintaining the professional rhythm that had built RedBridge into what it was today. The Morrison Tech situation was just one of several major decisions requiring my attention, though admittedly the most personally complex. Marcus appeared in my doorway at 1:45, holding his tablet with the careful expression he wore when delivering potentially complicated information. "Ms. Sullivan, the Morrison meeting has been moved to Conference Room A at your request. Also, I should mention that Jake Morrison arrived 20 minutes early and has been sitting in the lobby. He looks like he hasn't slept." I glanced up from the financial reports I'd been reviewing. Conference Room A was our main boardroom, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline and a conference table that could seat 20 people. I'd deliberately chosen it instead of the smaller meeting space we'd used yesterday, though I couldn't entirely explain why. "Thank you, Marcus. Send them up in 10 minutes. I gathered the Morrison Tech files and walked to the boardroom, my heels clicking against the polished floors with the measured pace I'd cultivated over years of high-stakes negotiations. The afternoon light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the mahogany table, and I positioned myself at the head, facing the door. When Robert and Jake entered, the contrast between them was immediately apparent. Robert looked tired but determined, wearing the same quality suit he'd worn to our previous meetings. Jake looked exhausted, his shirt slightly wrinkled and his usually perfect hair showing signs of repeated finger combing. His eyes were slightly red, though whether from lack of sleep or something else, I couldn't determine. "Gentlemen, please sit wherever you're comfortable," I said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the table. Robert chose a seat midway down the table, but Jake walked to the windows instead, standing with his back to us as he stared out over the Austin skyline. The silence stretched for several moments before he finally turned around. "This is what you see every day," he said, his voice hollow. "This view, this office, this level of success. And I spent 3 years thinking you were struggling to make it as a freelance consultant." "Jake," Robert said quietly, "we're here to discuss the business partnership." "Are we?" Jake moved to the chair directly across from me, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. "Because I've been thinking about this situation for 36 hours straight, and I can't figure out whether this is about business or revenge." I met his gaze steadily. RedBridge Capital doesn't make investment decisions based on personal motivations, positive or negative. Morrison Tech represents a solid opportunity for transformation and growth. "Really? Because the timing seems awfully convenient. You track our company for 6 months, watch me stress about our financial problems, then offer to save us right after breaking up with me." Robert leaned forward. "Son, Ms. Sullivan didn't break up with you. According to what you told me, you ended the relationship." Jake's face flushed. "Because I thought she was prioritizing work over our relationship. I didn't know her work was this." He gestured around the boardroom. "I thought she was staying late at some small consulting firm, grinding away for clients who didn't appreciate her, and if you'd known the truth, then I would have understood why she worked the hours she did, why she traveled constantly, why she needed an apartment like the one she was looking at downtown." The admission hung in the air between us. Jake Morrison, who'd broken up with me because I was too focused on my career, was now acknowledging that he'd never bothered to understand what that career actually entailed. "Jake," I said carefully, "would knowing about RedBridge have changed how you felt about our relationship, or just how you felt about my success?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I don't know. Maybe both." Robert cleared his throat. "Ms. Sullivan, I appreciate the complexity of this situation, but I need to understand whether RedBridge's interest in Morrison Tech is genuine, or whether we're being used to make some kind of point about my son's judgment." It was a fair question, and Robert Morrison deserved a direct answer. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be completely transparent with you. RedBridge identified Morrison Tech as an investment opportunity 6 months ago based purely on business fundamentals. Your technology platform is solid, your client base is loyal, and your company is positioned for growth in the expanding market." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "My personal relationship with Jake created a conflict of interest that I managed by maintaining professional boundaries. I never discussed Morrison Tech's business challenges with Jake, and I never used information from our personal conversations to inform RedBridge's analysis. But you knew we were struggling while I was telling you about our problems every night," Jake said. "I knew the healthcare technology sector was evolving rapidly, and that companies like Morrison Tech would need to adapt or face increasing challenges. That's industry knowledge, not insider information." Robert nodded slowly. "And the partnership offer? Is that genuine?" "Completely. RedBridge has successfully guided 7 healthcare technology companies through similar transformations. We understand the market dynamics. We have relationships with key players in telehealth integration, and we have the capital to fund rapid scaling." I activated the presentation screen and pulled up case studies from our previous investments. "This is MedConnect Solutions, a company we partnered with 18 months ago. Their revenue has increased by 400%. This is HealthBridge Systems, acquired 2 years ago, now the leading telehealth platform in the Southwest. The numbers were impressive, and both Robert and Jake studied them carefully. These companies were all similar to Morrison Tech when we first partnered. With them, I continued. Solid technology, loyal clients, but limited strategic vision for market evolution. Jake looked up from the presentation. And where are the original founders of these companies now? MedConnect's founder is still CEO, working with our strategic team. HealthBridge's founder chose to step back from day-to-day operations, but remains on the board and has made more money in 2 years than he did in the previous 10. And their family members who worked at the companies? I could see where he was heading with this line of questioning. In cases where family members had the skills and experience to contribute to the transformed company, they remained in appropriate roles. In cases where they didn't, we helped them transition to positions that better match their qualifications. The implication was clear. Jake's future at Morrison Tech would depend on his ability to contribute value to a rapidly evolving company, not on his relationship to the founder. Robert leaned back in his chair. Ms. Sullivan, if we move forward with this partnership, how would you handle the personal dynamics between you and my son? The same way I handle any professional relationship, with someone I have personal history with. Clear boundaries, defined roles, and focus on business objectives. You've done this before? I dated a client's son briefly in my second year running RedBridge. When that relationship ended, I maintained the professional relationship with his father's company. The project was successful, and both parties benefited. Jake's head snapped up. You dated another client's son? Briefly. It didn't work out, for reasons similar to our situation. He couldn't reconcile his assumptions about my success with the reality of what I'd built. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Jake Morrison wasn't the first man who'd struggled to understand that the woman he was dating had achieved more than he'd realized. Robert stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the city. Ms. Sullivan, I've been running Morrison Tech for 20 years. I built it from nothing, and I'm proud of what it's become. But I'm also realistic about its limitations. He turned back to face us. Without this partnership, Morrison Tech will probably survive, but it won't grow. My son will inherit a stable but stagnant company that becomes increasingly irrelevant as the industry evolves. Jake started to speak, but Robert held up his hand. With this partnership, Morrison Tech could become something I never imagined possible. Jake would have the opportunity to learn from people who understand strategic transformation, and the company could actually thrive in the new market landscape. Dad, you're talking about giving up control of everything you built. No, son. I'm talking about ensuring that everything I built has a future. The conversation had shifted, and I could see Robert Morrison making the mental transition from protective father to strategic business leader. He understood that accepting help required surrendering some control, but that the alternative was watching his life's work slowly decline. Mr. Morrison, I said, if you're ready to move forward, I can have contracts prepared by tomorrow afternoon. The board meets Thursday, and if they approve the partnership, we could begin implementation immediately. What would implementation look like? I pulled up a detailed timeline on the presentation screen. Month 1, Strategic Assessment and Management Integration. Month 2, Technology Platform Evaluation and Enhancement Planning. Month 3, Beginning of Telehealth Integration Development. Month 6, Launch of Comprehensive Healthcare Technology. Solutions Platform. Jake studied the timeline. And my role during this transition? You'd work with our client relations specialist to ensure existing accounts are maintained and expanded during the transformation. Your institutional knowledge of Morrison Tech's clients would be valuable for strategic account management. Strategic account management, he repeated. Not business development or strategic planning. Business development and strategic planning would be handled by our team in coordination with your father and our newly installed management structure. The distinction was clear, and Jake understood it. He wouldn't be learning to lead the company. He'd be learning to excel in a specific operational role within a larger strategic framework. Robert returned to his seat. "I want to accept the partnership, Ms. Sullivan. I think it's the right decision for Morrison Tech's future." Jake looked at his father with surprise. "Dad, we haven't discussed this as a family." "Son, I've been discussing this with your mother every night since Friday. She agrees that we need to prioritize the company's survival over our comfort with change." "And my opinion doesn't matter?" Robert's expression softened. "Your opinion matters enormously. But this isn't a democratic decision. This is a business decision that I have to make as the founder and majority owner of Morrison Tech." I could see the family dynamics playing out in real time. Jake had expected to be consulted as an equal partner in the decision, but Robert was asserting his authority as the company's leader. "Jake," I said quietly, "I understand this is difficult. Change always is, especially when it affects your professional future." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what the hardest part is, Emma? It's not that you're more successful than I realized. It's that you never trusted me enough to tell me the truth about what you'd built." The observation caught me off guard, partly because it contained a grain of validity I hadn't fully acknowledged. "You're right," I said. "I could have been more direct about my professional achievements. But Jake, you also never asked questions that would have led to those conversations. Maybe I should have. Maybe we both could have communicated better." Robert cleared his throat. "If you two need time to work through the personal aspects of this situation, I can give you some privacy." Jake shook his head. "No, Dad. The personal stuff is separate from the business decision. If you think partnering with RedBridge is right for Morrison Tech, then that's what we should do." I studied his face, trying to determine whether his acceptance was genuine or simply resignation to circumstances beyond his control. "Jake, I want you to understand that this partnership isn't about proving anything to you or making any kind of statement about our relationship. This is about giving Morrison Tech the best possible chance to succeed in a changing industry." "I believe you," he said. "I think I'm finally starting to understand the difference between personal and professional motivations." Robert smiled for the first time since entering the boardroom. "Ms. Sullivan, if you can prepare those contracts, I'll sign them tomorrow. I'll have them ready by noon." As we concluded the meeting, Jake lingered while his father gathered his materials. "Emma," he said when we were alone, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "If I'd understood what you were building, if I'd supported your success instead of competing with it, do you think we could have made it work?" The question was painful in its honesty, and it deserved an equally honest response. "I don't know, Jake, but I think we both deserve the chance to find out." He nodded slowly, then followed his father to the elevator. That evening, I stayed late preparing the Morrison Tech partnership contracts, working by the glow of my office lights as the city sparkled below. The rain had returned, streaking the windows and creating patterns of light and shadow across the documents. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Hayes. "Heard through the grapevine that Morrison Tech is moving forward. How are you holding up?" I typed back, "Professionally, everything's on track. Personally, it's complicated. Want to talk about it over dinner tomorrow?" "Yes, but first I need to get through the board meeting." I finished the contracts at nearly midnight, then drove home through the empty streets of downtown Austin. The penthouse apartment felt larger than usual, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting my movements as I moved through the rooms Jake had never really understood. In 48 hours, the RedBridge board would vote on the Morrison Tech partnership. If approved, Robert Morrison would become wealthy beyond his previous expectations, and his company would be positioned for dramatic growth. And Jake Morrison would begin working for the woman who'd broken up with him because she prioritized her career over their relationship, learning too late that her career was more significant than he'd ever imagined possible. Thursday morning dawned clear and sharp, The kind of November day that reminded me why I'd chosen Austin as the headquarters for RedBridge Capital. The city stretched out below my office windows like a promise, all glass and limestone and ambition reaching toward the hill country horizon. In 3 hours, my board would vote on the Morrison Tech partnership, and by evening, everything would be decided. Marcus knocked on my door at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying the leather portfolio that contained the finalized contracts Robert Morrison had signed the previous afternoon. Ms. Sullivan, the board members have all confirmed their attendance. Also, I should mention that Jake Morrison called this morning requesting to attend the meeting as an observer. I looked up from the financial projections I'd been reviewing one final time. Did he explain why? He said he wanted to understand the decision-making process that would determine his company's future. And he said he had something he wanted to say to you before the vote. The request was unusual, but not unprecedented. RedBridge occasionally allowed family members to observe board meetings when their companies were being discussed, though typically only the primary stakeholders participated directly. Tell him he can attend, but he'll need to understand that this is a business meeting with formal procedures. No interruptions during the presentation or board discussion. Understood. Should I prepare seating for him in the observer section? Yes. And Marcus, make sure we have both contract versions available. I want the board to see the alternative structure we offered, even though Robert chose the full partnership. The morning passed quickly as I finalized presentation materials and reviewed market analysis one last time. The Morrison Tech opportunity was solid by any measure, but I wanted the board to understand exactly why this particular investment made strategic sense for RedBridge's healthcare technology portfolio. At 11:30, I gathered my materials and walked to the main boardroom. The space commanded attention with its panoramic city views and polished conference table that reflected the Austin skyline. I'd chosen it deliberately for important decisions, understanding that environment influenced perception and perception influenced outcomes. Sarah Kim arrived first, as always, settling into her usual seat with the efficient movements of someone who'd been making investment decisions for longer than most people had been working. Emma, I've reviewed the Morrison Tech materials again. The technology platform is stronger than I initially realized. David Thompson followed, carrying his tablet and the leather notebook he used for particularly complex negotiations. I've been thinking about the management transition structure. It's more comprehensive than our usual approach, but the market timing justifies the additional oversight. Jennifer Walsh entered with her characteristic confidence, immediately activating her tablet and pulling up the Morrison Tech financial models. The projected returns are conservative, which I appreciate. Too many investment opportunities rely on optimistic scenarios. When all 5 board members were seated, Marcus escorted Robert Morrison into the boardroom. Robert looked exactly as he had during our previous meetings, professional and determined, though I could see the anticipation in his posture. This vote would determine whether his life's work survived and thrived or continued its slow decline toward irrelevance. Jake followed his father into the room, and I was struck by how different he looked from the man who'd left our apartment the previous week. He wore a charcoal suit I'd never seen before. His posture was straighter, and his expression carried a seriousness that replaced his usual casual confidence. Whatever he'd been processing over the past few days had changed something fundamental about how he carried himself. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. Thank you for accommodating this expedited meeting. The Morrison Tech opportunity represents exactly the kind of healthcare technology investment that aligns with RedBridge's strategic priorities. I activated the presentation system and began walking through the analysis that had consumed my attention for the past week. Market dynamics, competitive positioning, technology assessment, financial projections, and implementation timeline. The board members asked detailed questions about scalability, risk mitigation, and exit strategies, the kind of thorough examination that had made RedBridge successful. The management transition structure is more extensive than our typical approach, I explained. But healthcare technology transformation requires specialized expertise that Morrison Tech's current team doesn't possess. Sarah leaned forward. Emma, walk us through the alternative structure you mentioned in your preliminary notes. I pulled up the comparison charts showing both partnership options. Robert Morrison had the choice between full strategic partnership with RedBridge oversight or capital injection with limited consulting support. He chose the full partnership, understanding that it required surrendering some operational control in exchange for dramatic growth potential. David studied the financial models. The difference in projected returns is significant. $60 million versus $15 million over 2 years. Correct. The limited partnership would have allowed Morrison Tech to maintain complete operational independence, but growth would be constrained by their current strategic limitations. Jennifer pulled up additional data on her tablet. And you're confident that Morrison Tech's technology platform can support the kind of rapid scaling this partnership would require? Our technical assessment team spent 40 hours evaluating their systems architecture. The foundation is solid, and integration with telehealth platforms would be straightforward with proper development resources. The board discussion continued for another 20 minutes, covering risk assessment, competitive analysis, and implementation challenges. These were the conversations that separated successful venture capital firms from mediocre ones, the detailed examination of every factor that could influence investment outcomes. Finally, Sarah called for the formal vote. All in favor of approving the RedBridge Capital partnership with Morrison Tech Solutions under the terms outlined in the full strategic partnership proposal? 5 hands rose simultaneously around the table. Motion approved unanimously. Robert Morrison's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this process began. His 20-year-old company would not only survive, but positioned for growth that could make him wealthy beyond his previous expectations. Mr. Morrison, Jennifer said, congratulations. You've made the right decision for your company's future. Thank you, Robert replied. I know this partnership will require significant changes, but I'm confident RedBridge will guide us through the transformation successfully. As the board members gathered their materials and began to leave, Jake approached me near the windows, overlooking the city. Emma, could I speak with you privately for a few minutes? I nodded, and we waited until the boardroom was empty except for the two of us. Jake walked to the windows and stared out over the Austin skyline, his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally turned around, his expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. I've been thinking about what you said on Tuesday, about personal and professional motivations. And I've been thinking about the conversation we had in your conference room on Monday about when I became someone you didn't recognize. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The truth is, Emma, you didn't become someone I didn't recognize. You were always this person. I just never bothered to look closely enough to see who you really were. The admission hung between us, honest and painful. I spent 3 years assuming I understood your ambition, your work schedule, your priorities. I saw your success as something that competed with our relationship instead of something that could enhance our future together. Jake moved closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. When I sent that text message on Tuesday, I thought I was choosing a simpler life with someone who would prioritize what I thought mattered. But I wasn't choosing simplicity. I was choosing ignorance. I studied his face, trying to determine what he was really trying to say. Jake, what happened between us wasn't just about misunderstanding my career. It was about fundamental differences in how we viewed success, ambition, and what we wanted from life. You're right. But Emma, some of those differences were real, and some of them were based on assumptions I never bothered to examine. He sat down in one of the chairs facing the windows, his posture reflecting exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Ashley and I lasted exactly 4 days. Do you know why? I shook my head. Because when I tried to explain why I'd left you, I realized I couldn't articulate any reasons that didn't make me sound like an idiot. She asked me what you did for work, and when I said marketing consulting, she looked confused. Jake's voice carried a note of bitter irony. She said, "If she's just a marketing consultant, why does she live in that downtown penthouse and drive a car that costs more than most people's houses?" And I realized I'd never asked myself that question. "So you started researching RedBridge?" "I spent Sunday night reading everything I could find about your company, about your investments, about your reputation in the healthcare technology sector. Do you know what I discovered?" "What?" "That Emma Rodriguez Sullivan is considered one of the most innovative venture capitalists in Texas. That RedBridge has successfully transformed dozens of companies. That you've been quoted in industry publications as an expert on healthcare technology evolution." Jake's voice carried a mixture of admiration and regret. "I also discovered that 3 months ago, when I was complaining about Morrison Tech's financial problems, you were featured in Austin Business Journal for completing the largest healthcare technology acquisition in the city's history." The conversation was becoming more personal than I'd anticipated, but Jake seemed determined to work through everything he'd realized over the past week. "Emma, I need you to understand something. When I ended our relationship, I wasn't rejecting your success. I was rejecting what I thought was an unhealthy obsession with work that was preventing you from focusing on what really mattered. And now? Now I understand that your work was what really mattered, and I was too self-centered to recognize that someone could build something extraordinary while also maintaining a relationship." The honesty in his voice was undeniable, but it didn't change the fundamental dynamics that had led to our breakup. "Jake, even if you'd understood the scope of what I'd built, would that have changed how you felt about the hours I worked, the travel requirements, the networking events that consumed our weekends?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I don't know. Maybe I would have been more supportive if I'd understood what you were building. Or maybe I would have felt even more intimidated. And that's the real issue, isn't it? This isn't about misunderstanding my career. It's about whether you could be comfortable with a partner whose success exceeded your own." Jake's face showed the pain of acknowledging a truth he'd probably been avoiding. "You're right, and I hate that you're right, but you are." He stood and walked back to the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. "Emma, I want you to know that working with you and your team over these past few months is going to be complicated for me. Not because of anger or resentment, but because I'm going to be constantly reminded of what I was too blind to appreciate. Jake, we can structure your role to minimize direct interaction if that would be more comfortable. No, I think I need to be reminded. I think I need to learn what it looks like when someone builds something meaningful, because apparently I've never understood that before." The conversation had taken an unexpectedly mature turn, and I found myself respecting Jake's willingness to confront his own limitations. "There's something else," he continued. "I owe you an apology that goes beyond the personal relationship." "What do you mean?" "For the past 6 months, while you were evaluating Morrison Tech as an investment opportunity, I was dismissing your career and questioning your priorities. I was living with someone who could have solved my family's business problems, and I was treating her success as a personal inconvenience." Jake turned from the window to face me directly. "I don't know whether our relationship could have worked if I'd been more supportive, but I know it deserved the chance to succeed or fail based on who we actually were, not who I assumed we were." The apology was more thoughtful than I'd expected, and it deserved acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying that, Jake. I appreciate the honesty." "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you were building RedBridge, when you were working 18-hour days and traveling constantly and networking with investors, did you ever doubt whether it was worth the personal sacrifices?" The question touched on something I'd been thinking about throughout this entire situation. Every successful person questions whether their choices are sustainable. But Jake, I never saw my career as a sacrifice. I saw it as building something that could create opportunities for other people, generate wealth for investors, and transform industries in meaningful ways. And the relationship sacrifices? I always believed that the right person would see my success as an asset, not a liability. Someone who would want to build something together, rather than compete with what I'd already achieved. Jake nodded. Slowly. I understand now, and I understand why I wasn't that person. We stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city move below us. The conversation had brought closure to questions that had been lingering since his text message the previous week. Jake, I want you to know that the Morrison Tech partnership is going to be successful. Your father made the right decision, and RedBridge is committed to ensuring that the transformation benefits everyone involved. I believe you. And Emma, I want you to know that I'm going to work harder than I've ever worked to prove that I can contribute value to whatever Morrison Tech becomes. I don't doubt that. As we prepared to leave the boardroom, Jake paused at the door. Emma, in 6 months or a year, when the dust settles from all this change, do you think we could be friends? Not immediately, and not while everything's still complicated. But eventually. I considered the question seriously. I think we could be professional colleagues who respect each other. Whether that evolves into friendship would depend on how well we both handle the transition. That's fair. Jake extended his hand, and we shook with the formality of business partners rather than former lovers. Congratulations on your success, Emma. RedBridge Capital is lucky to have you as its leader. Thank you. And Jake, Morrison Tech is going to become something your father never imagined possible. That evening, I sat in my penthouse apartment with a glass of wine that cost more than most people's weekly salary, looking out over the city lights that stretched toward the horizon. Patricia Hayes was joining me for dinner to celebrate the successful Morrison Tech vote, but I had a few minutes alone to process what had happened over the past week. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Emma, this is Ashley. I wanted to apologize for the weird message I sent earlier. Jake explained everything about you and RedBridge. I had no idea who you were. I'm sorry for any confusion. I deleted the message without responding. Some situations didn't require acknowledgement. Another text arrived, this one from Marcus. Ms. Sullivan, the Morrison Tech contracts have been executed and filed. Implementation team meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Congratulations on another successful acquisition. I smiled and typed back, thank you. This one was particularly satisfying. The elevator chimed, and Patricia emerged with a bottle of champagne and the knowing smile she reserved for my most complex professional victories. So, she said, settling into the chair across from me, you just acquired your ex-fiancé's family company. RedBridge Capital acquired a promising healthcare technology firm that required strategic transformation. Emma, all right, yes. I just acquired Jake's family company. Patricia opened the champagne with practiced efficiency. And how does that feel? I accepted the glass she offered and considered her question seriously. It feels like justice, but not revenge. It feels like Jake Morrison finally understands what he walked away from, but also like he's going to be better for having learned that lesson. And you? I feel like I proved something I never needed to prove, but I'm glad I proved it anyway. Patricia raised her glass. To building your own table instead of waiting for someone else to offer you a seat. We toasted, and I looked out over the city that had given me everything I'd worked to achieve. Tomorrow, Morrison Tech would begin its transformation into a healthcare technology leader. Robert Morrison would become wealthy beyond his expectations, and Jake Morrison would start learning what it meant to work for someone who'd built something extraordinary. The woman he'd dismissed as too focused on work was now his business partner, and the career he'd seen as competition for his attention was now the foundation of his family's financial future. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and some realizations could only come through loss. Jake Morrison had learned both, and perhaps that understanding would serve him well in whatever came next. As for me, I had a company to run, investments to oversee, and a future to build that didn't require anyone else's approval or understanding. The city lights twinkled below like promises, and I was exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.